Welcome to the Dads on Tap podcast. This is Scott, and I'm your host for this weekly podcast. It has a very simple mission to help craft better dads. For the last several weeks, I've been taking you through some thinking I've been doing and some writing I've been doing around spiritual formation and just some things I've learned about how do we live into a life that is full of peace, with a soul at rest, that has dealt with issues of forgiveness, and that truly is thriving when it comes to our day-to-day life. And so last week we talked about when God doesn't fix it. We talked about some of the immaturity in the Christian faith and how we handle problems and challenges. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. It's a very meaningful, very powerful podcast that can help you as you struggle through the times when God doesn't come through for you the way you thought he should or hoped that he would. Today, I want to talk about a little different subject, kind of connected, but today I want to talk about the vows that we don't know that we make. The vows that we don't know that we make. Most of us have made promises that we don't remember making. And here's what I mean. We never sat down at a table, took out a pen, and wrote, "I will not need people," or put down on paper, "I will never get my hopes up again," or wrote down, "I'll never let someone hurt me like that again," or make a vow like, "I will handle life on my own." We didn't make those promises with words or on paper, but we made them subconsciously in the midst of our pain. Something happened to us, or something kept happening. And we finally reached a place where we just concluded that we need to make certain choices in order to survive. Maybe you could write down a list of different things. Maybe people were inconsistent for you, so you learn not to depend on them. Maybe you hoped for something deeply and were disappointed, so you kept leaning to learn. You learned to keep your expectations low, or maybe vulnerability was used against you, so you decided that you would never let anybody see that part of you again. Or maybe someone you trusted hurt or harmed you deeply, and you felt alone in the process. And these hidden vows we create around these disappointments, oftentimes in our childhood years, are not usually acts of rebellion. They're strategies to survive. And when we're little or when we're young, that strategy to survive sometimes tends to work. They help stabilize us. They help us to move forward. They help us to become strong in a particular area. They help us just to survive the difficult circumstances that we're going through. But a strategy that helps us survive one season can keep us from thriving in the next. See, it's a very big difference in life to be in survival mode versus thriving mode. And that resilience we create can harden into independence. The caution that we experience causes us to become guarded. We become uber confident because we feel like, man, we've got to figure this out on our own because no one else is going to help us. And that vow that protected us from some of the bad also begins to keep us from some of the good, because when we put up a wall, the wall may keep some of the bad out, but guess what that wall also keeps out? It also keeps out the good. A wall is no respecter of good or bad. It keeps everything out. And so that's what I want to explore for the next 12 to 14 minutes is the vows that we don't know we made. And what quiet agreements might you be living with that you never consciously intended to make? And what might happen if you allowed the Father and his Spirit, and possibly for me, it was a counselor needing the help of someone who could see things I couldn't see, to get beneath those vows to figure out what's really going on. Several years ago, I was talking with my counselor, Denise, and we were a couple years into the healing journey, and I was exhausted. And, we just spent session after session, often weekly, just digging through the layers of my story, childhood trauma and memories, family dynamics, experiences that had shaped how I reacted to people and situations. And it was really good, but it was exhausting. I remember at one point we were on the phone, and I just said to her, kind of half joking and honestly half seriously, I'm like, "Oh, Denise, when can this be over? I'm exhausted." She kind of chuckled. well, not dismissively. She understood. She says, "Guy, no, this is really hard work." And then she said something that I've never forgotten. She said, "Scott, a lot of your healing journey will be finished when there are no more unanswered questions." And guys, she was exactly right. I used to struggle with things like pornography. I used to get angry about things. I used to struggle in relationships. And before I took this journey of understanding what the hidden vows were, I had no idea why I was struggling so much. But then as we began to explore what was going on and why those things had such a strong hold on my life, I began to see the truth of what was happening. Before, I didn't have an answer for the question. And so I just would go into survival mode and I'd go on kind of autopilot and just do the things I'd always done. But when I began to understand what was going on under the surface, I began to be able to make different choices. And the scripture says that the truth, you will know the truth, Jesus said, and the truth will set you free. And as we get down underneath what's happening in these hidden vows, we begin to see the truth. And I often say, excuse my French, I often say jokingly that the truth will set you free. It might beat the shit out of you in the process. And it does. It is exhausting. But ultimately, that truth will set you free. And freedom does come when we do the hard work to grow and to answer the questions that we're struggling with day in and day out. Not because the struggle somehow magically disappears. I still experience temptation. I still have the ability to amp up pretty quickly, but now I know what it's about and I can make a different decision because I understand what's happening. And that's how the truth can set you free. So I want to encourage you um, to begin noticing the story that you're telling yourself when something hurts. You know, if a friend doesn't call you or you don't get that text, maybe you have the underneath the thought that, you know, see, you're on your own, man. They don't really care. You know, or if an opportunity disappears on you, you might have the thought, see, I knew it. I was foolish to hope or to trust. You know, or if someone sees you make a mistake or you reveal your weakness in some way, somehow underneath you think, oh man, they're going to think less of me, or we're going to be really hard on ourselves and carry the shame around. And I want you to know that we don't have to live that way. But for me, that self-reliance began really early in my childhood because there was a lot of chaos and I felt really lonely. I began to believe that I had to figure life out on my own. It was a necessary way for me to live. And if I could just stabilize myself emotionally and solve my problems independently and keep moving forward, you know, on my own, that I could build some strength and that would help me survive or maybe even thrive in life. I don't know that I even thought in terms of survive versus thrive. But God would reveal to me through my counseling and through some relationships and through my time in contemplative practice that those things were a wrong way to live and that I didn't have to rely on myself, that others were there for me and that God and his spirit were there for me too. But you know, one of the things that happened for me as I got into ministry, and if you've known me long or if you've listened for very long to the podcast, you know that I've been a pastor primarily for over 30 years, is that my ministry life kind of unintentionally supported or reinforced these hidden vows inside that I've got to figure out life on my own. And it's just kind of a lonely existence. In pastoral leadership, I would say many, if not most of the relationships you have are structured around a role. I'm the pastor. People have a need from the pastor. They know how to come to you and get what they need. And there's almost, I would call it a transactional relationship. So people approach you and you have meetings and you have conversations and you get invited to, as the pastor, to be a part of certain things. And there's just this built-in interaction and built-in connection around the role of being a spiritual leader. Well, one of the things I discovered was that when that role changed, when I moved on to a different role or moved out of a ministry, well, the relationships that I had that I once believed were more about friendship and caring for me, they began to thin out. And it was nothing dramatic. It wasn't like it was a betrayal or some kind of confrontation or that people did anything wrong. It's just that once I was gone, my role, my responsibility was gone. And that thing that the relationship was built on from the other side was gone too. And so rather than there being a friendship left, it was just someone else stepped into that role, took on that new responsibility. And I felt oftentimes left behind. Invitations slowed down. People initiated less. The conversations or even people reaching out became less and less frequent. And when that happened, something old began to stir. The old hidden vow that I've got to figure out life on my own. See, Scott, you're on your own. You got to figure this out. Even the people that you thought were your friends were really more about a role or responsibility. And if I'm not careful, maybe you've experienced this too. Maybe you've experienced this somehow in your family life or with friendships that kind of walked away or become quiet. It's really easy to let resentment begin to set in. Well, if they cared, they'd really reach out. If I mattered, maybe they would pursue me. But beneath that resentment and that frustration and discouragement is something really powerful. And it really is a need that God gave us, is that we long to be chosen beyond our usefulness. We want to know that our presence matters, not just our productivity. But oftentimes in life, it feels like, man, the productivity is what gets my foot in the door. It's what allows people to notice me. And when that goes away, oftentimes it feels like the relationship goes away. And, when that longing is not met, the old vows begin to show up, begin to say to ourselves, just stop expecting people to care about you or pursue. Don't risk disappointment. Don't step into new relationships. Just handle it yourself. And that resentment is really more about a grief that happens. It may sound angry on the surface, but underneath it all is simply us saying, man, we wanted to matter. We wanted someone to really want us and to see us for who we are, not just what we do. And maybe you can relate to that. If you can, I want you to know that there's hope, that there's freedom, that God can set us free, that He can relieve us of those hidden vows that we've made to ourselves and give us a whole new way of living. But it takes some work on our part. Let's see, where do I want to go from here? For about 20 years, there was a quiet prayer that lived in my kind of the background of my life. It was a prayer that was birthed early on in my marriage. And I felt like God said something to me that there was going to be a fulfillment. And so for years, I just quietly, honestly, hadn't shared it with anybody. I just quietly spent time in prayer over it and just wondered, could this be real? And last year, something began to move in regards to this hope, this dream, and this prayer. It began moving toward fulfillment in a really tangible and cool way. Conversations started to happen. Doors started to open that I was blown away by. Momentum started to form, and honestly, it felt really real. And it felt like something that a good father might just do. Although I had wondered, is this just me? Is this just my own selfishness? And so there was a question that showed up for me. And the question was, God, could you really be this good? God, could you really be this good? That a prayer, a hope, a dream that I had prayed for years and waited for and wondered if it would ever happen was now starting to unfold right in front of me. It felt pretty good, and I was still a bit cautious. And that season went on for about 4 months, and then in December of last year, it stopped completely abruptly. Not gradual, not ambiguous. The person I was in discussions with and conversation with passed away. So a door didn't slowly close, it completely vanished. And not only did it vanish, but what we would come to discover is a lot of those conversations actually died with that person. And it didn't take long for confusion to set in for me. Maybe you've had this kind of an experience. You thought, you hoped that something was going to happen. It looked like maybe there's a spark of opportunity. You let your hopes get up a little bit, and then it just completely disappeared. And I began to question God in our relationship. Why would something that seems so much like a gift begin to unfold and then like completely disappear? Like it was gone overnight. Why would God let this start and then just take it away so quickly and so finally, like it was just gone? And in moments like this in our faith, and I know as a pastor, I have this tendency or this temptation that we try to rush toward a kind of a correct spiritual answer. Well, God is sovereign, or he knows best, or everything happens for a reason. A lot of people online these days are like, well, see, God doesn't exist anyway. Like, what are you doing? Like, stop it. Stop that thinking. And, there's a lot of answers during seasons like this, seasons to just keep trusting, or seasons to walk, or ideas of trust, or ideas of just walking away. And some of those statements may be true, right? Like, yes, God is sovereign. He has control of it all. But man, that if we just go with that, it kind of bypasses the heart. It bypasses the pain. It bypasses the emotion. It dismisses God too easily. And so I began to process what happened with Natalie. We both were experiencing that together. I began to process that with a few close friends, and certainly wrestling with it before the Lord. And God in his presence didn't resolve that. Even today, there's still some wondering, still some confusion. But here's what happened, or here's what has happened over time. Something kind of steadier began to form in me. I don't have an explanation for it, but I do trust. I really wanted an outcome. I thought maybe God was providing it, but what I recognized was I can still have confidence about God's character. I believe he's not only a good father, but he's the best father. And so if that's true, then when these things disappear, man, God's not withdrawing himself. He just has something else for us. There's something he wants to teach us. And what I began to learn is that the goal in day-to-day life is not to become captivated by an outcome. Man, I was so excited. I was head over heels. I could not believe that something like this was going to happen. But even though it disappeared, I still know that God is good. I still know that hope is not foolish. I still know that desire is not wrong. What I also know is that my peace doesn't depend on a particular outcome. The answer to is, God, could you be this good, is not when an outcome comes that I had hoped for and prayed for. It's that God walks alongside of me in the midst of the disappointment, in the midst of the confusion, and he still brings me to a place of peace. He still brings me to a place of peace. In John 5, Jesus approached a man who had been unable to walk for 38 years, and he asked him a really interesting question. He said, do you want to be healed? Now, doesn't that sound like an unnecessary question? Of course, the man wants to be healed. But the man doesn't say yes. He actually begins to explain the system that he's been living inside of. He says, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred, and someone else always gets there ahead of me. And after 38 years, he's reached some conclusions, this guy has. Healing only happens in one way. Someone else always wins. I don't have anyone. And this is simply how life works. And when you go through a season of disappointment, it's so easy to think like this man, like I'm stuck in the system. Nothing is working. I'm just going to be disappointed and I'm stuck in this place. But what I love is that Jesus doesn't argue with his explanation. He just interrupts it. He says, get up, take your mat, and walk. And the healing that this man wanted didn't come through the system that he had learned to trust. It came through an encounter with Jesus himself. And so what I'm learning is that regardless of whether negativity or disappointment comes, I can still trust Jesus in my Heavenly Father, to know that I'm not on my own, to know that hope is not dangerous, to not believe that just how things work, they're not going to work out for me. Jesus wants us to see something differently, that he is moving and he is working, sometimes in the way that we think he's supposed to, and sometimes in the way that we have no idea what he's up to. And so I've been there, and maybe you're there too. And so I want to just encourage you today as I close the podcast. Maybe your hidden vow is not self-reliance. Maybe you have a hidden vow or some false belief underneath that just says, man, I'm not going to get my hope up. See, I told you it's just not going to work out. I got to try to prove my worth. I can't let anybody see my weakness. I'll never let anybody hurt me like that again. Man, I get it. Those were things that may have served you well for a while, but they're not going to lead you into a life of thriving. And so renouncing a vow like that, when we recognize it, doesn't have to be dramatic. It might just begin with a quiet acknowledgement like, I learned to survive by myself. And it kind of made sense for me to be independent. It helped me at a season of life, but it's what helped me then isn't really helping me now. And not experiencing shame about our past, but a curiosity. But what if I began to live life differently? What if I replaced that hidden vow with a vow to trust God more? You see, freedom does not mean that we depend on everyone or that we trust without wisdom. It means we become free to connect without clinging to something, to hope without demanding an outcome. You know what? God opened up a door. He gave me some really unique things. There was a lot that I learned from that season, and then it disappeared. And God has something else that He wants to show me, wants to teach me, and I can find hope in that. Even when the desire was disappointed, I can still find hope that God is at work. And so I just want to encourage you as I close the podcast. God is still at work in your life. And I want you to hopefully take some time in this next week to notice when you have strong emotional reactions, when you might be feeling something like resentment or fear or defensiveness or the urge to pull away. I want you just to pause, and I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. What story am I immediately telling myself right now? Second question, what pain might my heart be trying to protect? And 3, what promise did I quietly make because of that pain? And don't attack it with anger, meet it with compassion. Try to figure out what is that vow that is underneath this thing in my life, this disappointment, and thank God for the strength that's helped you survive. And then ask Him, would you help me move beyond this vow to a place of truly trusting in you? Listen for His invitation. One of the things I've sensed over the last, now, goodness, we're going on, I guess, 8 months since that disappointment showed up in a real tangible way, is that God is deepening me. God is drawing me to a place of trusting Him more, not trusting some outcome or even another person. Not that I don't trust people, that's not what I'm saying, but that ultimately my hope comes from Him. And that if I know that and I can live that the outcomes that come are the outcomes that He intends for me. And I'll tell you, there's a great peace in knowing that I don't have to drive the outcome. It doesn't depend on me. My job is to trust, to receive, to belong, to hope. And those things allow me to thrive as I live my life. And so I just hope that's an encouragement to you. If I can ever do anything to help you or this little conversation sparked something in you, went a little long this week, about 25 minutes, but I hope it was encouraging. Feel free to reach out, scott@dadsontap.com. But as we close, I just want to remind you that a God-immersed life is not a life without need, without disappointment, or without unanswered questions. It's a life in which those things no longer get the final word. It's a life in which we pursue the understanding we need from our Heavenly Father. And we've come to realize that His invitation is not simply to survive what happened to us as we've been growing up, whether it's in our childhood years or our adult years. His invitation is to trust Him as He leads us into a place of freedom. And I can promise you this, there is no better place to be than in the center of God's will, trusting Him and looking with hope at what His outcomes might be, whether or not we understand them. So thanks again for your time this week. Let's take something you've learned today and take it home to go be a better dad. And I look forward to talking to you again next week.